I'm not asking for you to bid on the orchids this time. We're actually going into our program, although it is still open. At the end of the afternoon break, we will close it off, and there's still an amazing deal. So there's lots of room, and you'll still take home a bargain. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you back to the second half of our Teaching and Learning Institute Day. We had an amazing start this morning, and not just for the cappuccinos and lattes. We had amazing workshops this morning, and just talking to several of you around the room, it sounds like one was better than the next, and the frustrating part is you could only go to one. So that more opportunity and more reason to be talking to your colleagues and finding out what they did in their workshop. I would like to take this opportunity really to thank those who made this day possible. A very big thank you to the Teaching and Learning Institute team, and this is really Darlene's baby, so to speak. Darlene has always provided wonderful leadership to this incredible day. And what an opportunity on International Women's Day to have an amazing woman leader who arranged this day. There were also many staff, students, which I was thrilled about, and family leaders who all worked together to make this day run smoothly. It takes a lot of effort, and we thank you all. As an academic health science center, teaching and learning is fundamental to everything we do, and thank you for wanting to improve continuously to make the student experience here at Holland Bloorview the best it can possibly be. Because we know that many of you around the room at one point may have been a student here as well. And that's how we get the best staff that we have. It's because of all of your leadership and commitment to students, to teaching, and to learning that we're able to provide our students with fundamental skills and experiences that they have to begin their journey in their career. We are proud of our affiliation with the University of Toronto and many other educational institutions across the province, and having the opportunity to collaborate with our families, our children and youth, with our students, makes the experience here at Holland Bloorview even better. This afternoon, we have a keynote speaker, a series of presentations from our very own Holland Bloorview colleagues, and our annual Student and Teaching Recognition Awards, and a ceremony at the end of the afternoon, and of course the break where you can network and bid on the orchids. Did I mention it's Capes for Kids Week? I hope you enjoy the afternoon's programming, as it's really designed for you based on feedback from last year and previous years. It is now my pleasure to welcome our President and CEO, Julia Handigsburg, who's going to say a few words before we introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Golda, and thank you very much, Golda, for your leadership of teaching and learning at Holland Bloorview. So many people contribute to making a day like this possible, but it wouldn't be possible without your extraordinary leadership of our academic mission. So thank you so much for everything you do. I too am not going to mention the orchids because I'm the top bidder, so do not bid anymore. Stop right now. No, that's terrible. My foundation colleagues would be very mad at me. We want to make lots of money for kids at Holland Bloorview, so bid. There's a lot going on, and Teaching and Learning Day is part of our amazing calendar every year at Holland Bloorview. As you all know, it's Capes for Kids, and it is amazing that, everything seems to go with a cape. I don't know, those of you who are wearing capes, don't you feel just fantastic? When you get dressed in the morning, there's literally nothing that doesn't go with a shiny red cape. And particularly when you have this gold lining, right? You feel pretty elegant. Lindsay and I were commenting that, it gives you that kind of 80s shoulders that, we don't need to bring the big hair back, but the shoulders always made you look good, right? The shoulders always worked. So we're delighted that it's Capes for Kids, and so many of you are participating and supporting Capes for Kids through your extemporaneous silent auction, which is amazing. It's also Social Work Month. And we are thrilled at Holland Bloorview to have an amazing social work team that is so integral to everything we do, from the perspective of care we offer to our kids and to our families, and helping them to navigate through this extraordinary healthcare system that we all play a part in. So could any social workers in the room stand up, please? To you and your students, thank you so much for the contribution you make here at Holland Bloorview and across all the work that you do. Golda already mentioned that it's also International Women's Day, and of course that's another important day in our calendar and an important way to celebrate leadership. So since many of us in the room would, I'm sure, like to take a stretch, how about all the women stand up in this room? Pausing. Is there any way I can find a way for some men to stand up? I haven't really come across one yet, but I'll keep thinking about that, and maybe by the end of my remarks I'll have something to say to you guys. I am thrilled to be here. I have, ever since I started at Holland Bloorview, I've been here for every teaching and learning day, and it is such an important day in our calendar. It's also a day that creates incredible value, not only for Holland Bloorview, but I know for each and every one of you. And I know that because of the energy you bring to the room, because you're here. You know, we are all extremely busy. We all have enormous caseloads of clients who we need to serve, and we have enormous work that we're doing every day. And the fact that you are here and devoting the time that you do to making this day what it is, to being part of creating the day, to be teaching during the day, and to be learning during the day is the absolute best testament to how important it is to you, and correspondingly, how important the academic mission of Holland Bloorview is to you. As an academic health science center, as Golda just said, our teaching and learning is critical to our success. It's critical to the care that we deliver here, but even more so, it's critical to the care that's delivered across all of our systems. The trainees who come here over their time at Holland Bloorview, many of them will continue on here, and they'll be valued members of our team, and we love when that happens, but they will also go off all over the province and the country and the world, and they will bring what they learn from you together out into that world. And that is really what the role of academic health sciences is. It's driving the best practice and the best knowledge into care, but it's also taking what we know and spreading it. And so I'm so proud of the work we do in that regard. I'm so proud of your commitment to excellence, which again is why you're here today, because you know that the work you do is extraordinary, but you are willing to devote the time and the energy and the investment in continuing to teach each other, to learn together, and to spend time learning from people like our terrific Keynote, who is about to speak to us very shortly. Today is all about connections. We modestly called our new strategy No Boundaries. In making those connections in your teaching, you're also going to be driving connections into care, and you're also together driving connections across the system. And all of that is really critically important to the thing that matters most to us, which is the lives of children and families, and making those lives and enabling the world in which our kids to live to be the kind of lives that are full of meaning, full of potential, full of good health and good futures. So I'd like to thank again the Teaching and Learning Institute for the tremendous work that they do all year round, but in particular for their leadership in bringing together an incredible day every year, and to thank you all for your commitment to the work we do here at Holland Bloorview and to the future leaders in our systems, in our healthcare, and in our care. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia and Golda, for your opening remarks. Good Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darlene Hubley, and just so pleased to be here to say hello and welcome you as well this afternoon. We really hope you're having a wonderful day. We developed the theme this year around connections, and just so exciting to see everyone in the room who is also jazzed about education, having a chance to reflect on your education practice, build your skills, and connect with colleagues and connect your ideas. And we just hope you have a really wonderful afternoon. Thank you for acknowledging my role in building this day, but I certainly work very closely with a wonderful, wonderful team. And I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the group. Barb Smith, Joanne, Adrian, Amir, Beth, Kelly, Sharon, Lori, Kim, and Tess. And this has been a wonderful crew. You'll see our faces around the room and in the hallways. And we are here to make your afternoon flow smoothly. Don't hesitate to let us know if you have any questions, or if you, as you generate ideas this afternoon, check in with us. We really want to hear how this day is going for you. We have evaluations. We welcome your feedback. So at the end of the day, please let us know how this day was, how it fit for you, and we'll take your ideas and hopefully continue to build on them and continue having teaching and learning days in the future. So I just want to, again, thank you, welcome you, and thank this wonderful group for the day. And let me invite Golda back to introduce our keynote speaker.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Arno Kumagai. Dr. Kumagai is the Vice Chair in Education in the Department of Medicine at U of T and holds the F.M. Hill Chair in Humanism Education from Women's College Hospital at University of Toronto. Dr. Arno Kumagai received his Bachelor of Arts in Comparative Literature from UC Berkeley and his Doctor of Medicine from UCLA School of Medicine, where he completed his residency in internal medicine and an endocrine fellowship and postdoc. Prior to his role at the University of Toronto, he was on the faculty of the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And I'm sure it was just because of your love for the Toronto Maple Leafs that you crossed the border, left the Detroit Red Wings behind.
I'm not into football.
We really are lucky to have him here. He's known as an international recognized education scholar, an endocrinologist with expertise in intensive management of type 1 diabetes. Having done bench research, he then suddenly did a shift, I guess saw the light, so to speak, and went into looking at from diabetic complications into medical education scholarship. He has received many awards for his work and leadership, including the Association of American Medical Colleges Pfizer Award for Humanism in Medical Education, the Kaiser Permanente Award for Teaching Excellence, and the University of Michigan's Distinguished Leader in Diversity Award. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Arno Kumagai.
Thank you, Golda, Darlene, and the whole group for this absolute honor of being here today. After I received the invitation, I also received a second invitation to come up and spend some time here, just an afternoon, talking to different people and looking at the facilities. And I have to say, I was absolutely blown away. I'm as a specialist in type 1 diabetes, everything is about teamwork, everything is about interprofessional care, with really the person with diabetes being kind of the center, right? Being very much a full partner in care. And I see this model replicated in really interesting, diverse, and innovative ways here. I mean, everything from the way care is structured to even the way the playroom was designed. I was absolutely floored by how patients, how the families were involved in actually saying, this is how we wanted things, right? So congrats. But anyway, so this is an absolute honor to be here today. Let's see if this, I plug There we go. That work? Ah, good. Okay. And do you know how to switch it, Greg, to the monitor?
Turn the monitor just off your laptop.
Oh, just off the laptop. Okay, great. Okay, super. So the title of the talk today is "We Make the Road While Walking: Stories, Dialogue, and the Possibilities of Care," and it's meant to tie up a lot of the themes that you've been talking about all year long, but particularly today. I'd like to start out by saying, and this is just a University of Toronto thing, we, the disclosure statement is that, my wife is also an endocrinologist, and she's always telling me that, I should spend more time like thinking of writing a best-selling novel rather than doing what I'm doing. And unfortunately, I'm not smart enough or creative enough to really come up with a bestseller like Harry Potter. So unfortunately, I have absolutely no conflicts of interest to declare this time, or probably ever for that matter. And as a specific notice disclaimer, I do not grow or sell orchids. Okay, so sorry, Golda, or capes. However, as Darlene had said, I moved from the States, so I'm actually an American. Grew up in California. And a lot of people, including my 9-year-old son, Apollo, were particularly skeptical about our reasons for moving up. I moved up in April 2016, and my wife Eleni and Apollo joined me 3 months later, just a few months before the election. So when my son came up to us after we made the decision to move, he came up and he said, he's a kind of precocious little kid. He comes up and he goes, "Papa, I need to ask you something." And I said, "What?" He goes, "This Toronto thing." And I said, "The Toronto thing?" And he goes, "Yeah, the Toronto, that we're moving." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, I need to know something. Are we moving there because of the job or because of Trump?" And at the time, it was a remote possibility. And I said, "Well, actually, both." And he goes, "Okay, I just need to know." But then, as the election happened and things were going on, looking more and more dire, I decided to reframe this into kind of a heroic narrative. And I said, "Look, the way to look at this, Apollo, is that we are actually the beachhead. We are the front line in the refugee movement north." So he got really jazzed by all of this. He thought that this was pretty cool, that we were, heroic and all that. And then he believed me that I said that we would actually be joined by Justin Trudeau, who would see us at the border and greet us with a hug and a blanket. And he thought, wow, this is, because he really thinks Trudeau's really cool, right? But then where I think I really stretched kind of his sense of skepticism is when I told him that we would also be joined by the greatest refugee of all, Barack Hussein Obama. And he thought, no. So anyway, but that's very much a part of our move and part of the narrative that we've, at least I constructed our move. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands that we are on. This is the traditional lands, the Haudenosaunee Saunee people, and of the most recently the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. So I think it's important that we acknowledge the land that we live on and we use and we work on. The great Irish playwright, George Bernard Shaw, said something that's actually resonated with me over the years that I've worked in medical education. He said, "I do not know of a single thoughtful and well-informed person who does not feel that the tragedy of illness at present is that it delivers you helplessly into the hands of a profession which you deeply mistrust." That's moi, right? And no, so what does that mean? Why is there such skepticism about not only physicians, but about healthcare professionals? There's some kind of disconnect between people's needs and healthcare delivery that is kind of summed up by this statement. So for me, as part of this kind of these musings, I decided that the number one question in health professions education is what kind of health professionals are we trying to create? That's ultimately, it has very little in some ways to do with competencies. It does have to do with clinical skills and knowledge and things, but it goes beyond that, right? Whom are we trying to fashion in the work that we do in education? I would like to make the modest proposal that one way of looking at this is that we are trying to create professionals who practice with excellence, compassion, and justice. And those three pieces, excellence, compassion, and justice, actually form the core of what we're attempting to do in education. Looking at it through this lens, healthcare at its core becomes a profoundly humanistic, social, and ethical practice. We oftentimes delude ourselves into thinking that medicine is a science. Medicine is not a science, actually. Medicine is a science-using profession. Social work is a science-using profession, as is physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language pathology. Right? We are not scientists. We deliver care. So it involves something that is deeply human and deeply ethical. So the goals of this talk today are to talk about the idea of person-centered care from a variety of different perspectives, philosophical, ethical, and humanistic. To look at how partnerships between healthcare professionals can enhance this perspective, how this perspective is taught and learned. And the roles of stories and dialogues in teaching about the practice of healthcare with excellence, compassion, and justice. So the idea of patient-centered care or person-centered care is not new. It's actually very, very old. It's just that it's receiving more and more attention these days. To give you an example, this is the United States Institute of Medicine report in 2001 called the Crossing the Quality Chiasm. And in this report, they define patient-centered care as providing patient care that is respectful of and responsive to individual patient preferences, needs, and values, ensuring that patients guide all clinical decisions. That's one form of, one definition of person-centered care. I have some disagreements with this in some ways. We can talk about that later. Interestingly, so the Department of Medicine, the University of Toronto, the department, so I'm vice chair of education there, so I oversee all the education of about 1,000 trainees for the department and all the hospitals and things. Shortly after I signed on the dotted line, they flew me up here to go into this retreat of the leadership of the department. And this is everybody. This is the basic scientists, the clinical investigators, the clinicians, the educators, the administrators, everybody, right? They go up to Niagara on the Lake, and we had this 2-day meeting where they crafted the strategic priorities for the department. And these were goals that were met for the next 5 years, but really much longer than that. So out of this, it was fascinating because I'm kind of a newbie, right? I mean, I was still looking at things in terms of like Fahrenheit and milligrams per deciliter. Do you know what? One thing that was incredible shock. I mean, so I'm a diabetes specialist. I agreed to come up here and then realized that you folks measure glucose in a really weird way. You use millimolar? Right, millimoles per liter. So believe me, when I'm thinking about it, I mean, when people say 5, which is supposed to be normal, right? I'm thinking 5, we got to get glucose. So there was some adaptation. But anyway, so I'm sitting at this retreat, and the funny thing that came out of this 2-day retreat were the priorities, and the top priority for the department. This is for everybody, okay? The 800 faculty in this department. The top priority was to ensure the perspectives and experience of our patients and their families drive our work. Interestingly, the second priority was promoting equity, diversity, and professionalism. These are the top 2 priorities of the biggest department of medicine in North America, one of the top departments in the world. So the chair, Jillian Hawker, who was the one who recruited me up here, said, what do you think of the retreat? I said, I got to be honest with you, this is the biggest department I've ever been in, but I'm surprised that out of all the goals, you could pick these 2 as the top priorities. And she kind of chuckled. She goes, why do you think we recruited you up here? Because so I have a mandate to drive this educational. So words. We use a lot of words to describe things. We oftentimes don't define them. So let me just take a moment. Patient-centered care. In the States, we're using patient and family-centered care, person-centered care, relationship-centered care. Relationship-centered care is used a lot among psychiatrists, to really kind of articulate the relationship between the therapist or the psychiatrist and the patient or the service user. I personally, and what we've done as a department, we've personally highlighted the idea of person-centered care, because as we all know, people aren't always patients, right? When they leave the clinic, they're no longer patients. So we really wanted to highlight kind of more of a holistic approach to thinking about the people that we work with. So there are challenges, though, to person-centered care. Some of them are the development of science. Things go so fast that we oftentimes are left ethically catching up, right? Trying to figure out how to adapt to these rapid developments. Another is the commercialization of healthcare, and because the bottom line is so important in keeping institutions open, keeping people paid, healthcare oftentimes becomes a business. And while I think that's important, okay, while I think that's essential, that's clearly not the whole picture. And I sometimes feel very uncomfortable about this idea of talking about patients as customers, because they're much, as you all know in this room, our patients are much, much more than mere customers. There is also this idea of kind of the conveyor belt of healthcare. Since I'm from the southeast Michigan area near Detroit, I always think of it in these terms, right? You put people in, you kind of get them out, and you use templates and flow sheets, and we oftentimes forget the individuals on the conveyor belts, and it becomes too impersonal. And then the whole idea of the sheer complexity of what we're doing. I mean, not just the processes, the illnesses that we see, and the complexity of healthcare financing and the complexities of modern living. These all threaten to swamp the way we see ourselves and our patients. One of the other, I think, challenges, which can also be very good, so don't get me wrong, I don't think this is absolutely horrible, is this idea of the electronic medical record. When we, several years ago, when we implemented the medical record in our clinics in Michigan, in the diabetes clinic, the people who designed the clinic really hadn't thought of it. And what they did was they put the computer here, and the desk here, and the patient here, right? So if I had to work on the computer, I had my back to the patient. So I had a choice to either look at the patient or look at the computer. So really, I mean, for me, one of the wonderful things was that so many people, so many of the physicians objected to that and demanded a change, that they actually did change things. Unfortunately, what they did was they moved the desk between me and the patient. So I had to actually look behind the computer screen to see what was going on, make sure they were still upright and breathing. And it's so there are these things in terms of design, right? Even the design of the layout of things that we have to think about. That's why I'm so amazed at this place, right? I walk in, you have a low ceiling when you walk in, so that people aren't intimidated by seeing this huge atrium. But yet, if you continue to walk, it opens up. And then you go to the art room and it opens up, right? So people think about how space is used and what it does to people and how they think about themselves and the work they do. So time is also another thing, right? This is also a pressure. I mean, I have people who come to my clinic. I followed people for 20 years when I was at Michigan. Some of them had amazing stories. Some of them had terrible tragedies. During the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, I had every single clinic I was in, somebody had lost their home, their job, or both. Okay, and in the States, if you lose your job, you lose your insurance. So to buy a single vial of Humalog insulin, right, up here it's about 35 Canadian. In the States, the exact same vial, exact same prescription is, well, US, it's about $260, so that's about $300 Canadian. Okay, almost tenfold difference. And folks went from having insurance pay for that overnight to having to pay for it themselves, plus figure out where they're going to live, plus figure out how they're going to feed their families. So these are the things that we constantly thought of, but we had to try to solve all of this in a 15-minute visit. right? So one of the questions and one of the comments that I often hear from many colleagues is, well, I don't have time to talk with my patients. I need to get them in and get them out because I don't have enough time, right? And it's funny because this came up, a friend of mine, Karen Devon, who's a wonderful endocrine surgeon who's interested in humanism and ethics and surgery. We were chatting about this one day, and she said, so I don't know how to answer my colleagues when they say, well, we are so busy in the OR and in the wards, we don't have time to spend talking to families. And I said, I figured out a good response for that. She said, what? And I said, well, then why don't you just say, look, if you really are interested in saving time in the operating room, in the OR, why don't you everybody agree not to close any of the surgical wounds, right? So that after you're done with the surgery, you put a wet blanket over them and wheel them out. And she looked at me as though I had grown two heads and said, you cannot do that. And I said, why not? She goes, okay, you're an internist, you may not understand these things, but it's surgery, you actually have to close the wound. And I said, why? And she goes, it's essential. I said, so is talking with families. So it depends on where the priority is, right? But anyway, so she has to steal that. So if you hear it from her, I gave her permission to use that. Okay. The other thing that comes up in scholarship is really interesting, that comes up in health implementation of person-centered care, is this idea of evidence. Okay, what is the evidence that person-centered approaches leads to better clinical outcomes or a better bottom line, right? And this is big. So like commercialization of healthcare, if we're really nice to our patients, they're going to come back and they're going to come here rather than going to LMC, I don't know. Why? So we think of it that way, or we think of it in terms of evidence. What is the evidence based on clinical trials that my spending time talking with my patient is going to lead to better control of his diabetes, for instance, right? And there are a lot of different trials, a lot of different experiments that have looked at this, and this is what I call where's the beef question. So for you who are older in the audience, you might remember the Burger King commercial of these three little old ladies sitting around, and they're looking at a big bun with a little tiny patty, and the little old lady's going, where's the beef, right? So that's the idea, is where's the evidence, where's the stuff that all this stuff works? And I guess the way I would look at it is thinking about this, though. If you take a big step back and you don't think necessarily just about evidence-based medicine, and believe me, I'm an endocrinologist, okay? We live off of evidence-based medicine. But what if we were to ask ourselves, well, do we really need evidence to justify our treating our patients as human beings? So think about it. I mean, isn't that really the bottom line? Isn't there something that is a higher calling than just the evidence that something works to help us treat our people, our patients as humans, right? So when we're talking about this idea of person-centered care, another question arises. What does it actually mean to center one's care on the person? How does that translate? I mean, what does that mean philosophically? What does it mean to as me? And one way to look at this is this kind of calls into question the whole idea of the relationship between the self and the other. Okay? So in my thinking in this area, in designing educational curriculum designs and educational activities, I've been very influenced by this one French philosopher by the name of Emmanuel Levinas. His writing is nearly impossible to understand, but a fascinating man. He was born actually in Latvia and moved to France when he was very young. He grew up and was educated in France, but early on, back actually in the late 1920s, he went to Germany because he'd heard that there was a great German philosopher by the name of Edmund Husserl, and he wanted to study with him, so he went to Freiburg. But while he was there, he ran across Husserl's kind of young sidekick, a guy named Martin Heidegger, who had written a book called Being in Time. And this Being in Time transformed the face of Western philosophy. So Levinas became an absolute Heidegger groupie. I mean, he thought he was absolutely amazing, and he spent years studying with him until Heidegger declared himself as a Nazi and joined the Nazi Party, whereby Levinas, who was Jewish, broke relations, went back to France, fought for 1 month in the French army, was defeated and sent to a POW camp where he spent the rest of the war. That was unfortunate for Levinas, but in some ways very fortunate, because really horribly, the rest of his family was actually wiped out during the Holocaust. The reason I bring all of this up is because it actually, these experiences shaped the way he looked at philosophy. And his whole drive after the war was to create a philosophical response to Heidegger. Okay, so Heidegger's idea was that the most important thing was to study being as a human being. Okay, what did it mean to exist? And Levinas said, no, the foundation of being human is not being, as Heidegger would say, the das Sein, but is actually the relationship with the other. And that at its core, this relationship was ethical. So it's not this abstract concept of why we exist, but it's how we exist with other people. What does it mean to exist, and what our obligations are to other people, okay? So Levinas also says that the other person presents him or herself in uniqueness and mystery. He calls it the epiphany of the face. I discover that person in front of me. I attempt to understand who they are, but I can never do that. They're always fleeing because they become someone different, right? So there's always mystery at the bottom of this other person, and we have to understand that. We have to respect that. And the other thing that he says that really drove his point home to me in terms of kind of the way I think about things is he says, for no reason other than being another human being, one gives oneself completely and humbly to the service of the other in their need and suffering. So it doesn't matter who this person is in front of me. It doesn't matter who I am, where I come from. It doesn't matter what we share, what we don't share. It doesn't even matter if I know that person. Because I'm a human being and because that is another human being, my obligation, my responsibility is to that person. To the point, as Levinas would say, of sacrificing my life for theirs. So you can see in this philosophy how in some ways the ghosts of the Holocaust exist, right? It's caring for another person above and beyond what would be expected. It's also, interestingly enough, it's caring for another person with humility and with reverence. He says, you answer that call from on high. Okay, it is a humble service. So in looking at this, sources of dehumanization, the opposite of what Levinas is talking about, is essentially the pride of the self, this idea that you can see the other person as an object and assume knowledge, total knowledge of him or her. So if I'm taking care of somebody with diabetes, I can assume that I know everything about them based on a single number, their hemoglobin A1C, how their diabetes is doing, right? And that actually depersonalizes them. It takes away their humanity and it takes away their uniqueness. But what's really interesting about this idea is that it actually goes to the heart of issues of equity, right? Because if I see someone who, based on the way they look or their accent or their gender or their sexual orientation or what kind of clothes they wear, how much money it looks like they have, and if I assume I know them, that's actually what lies at the heart of prejudice. So in some ways, person-centered care is the same as culturally safe care. The two actually exist as two parts of exactly the same thing. It is because person-centered care and culturally safe care are limited by the same principle, that is justice. So what is the ultimate goal if we look at things this way, right? I would suggest that the ultimate goal of person-centered care is actually to recognize the mystery of the other and to act on this awareness and this obligation. We are obliged to that person even though we will never, ever know fully who he or she is. Okay, so the big question arises, how do you actually teach this? How do you actually teach this perspective, right? And this is the thing that has got me into kind of almost a near obsession over the past 15 years. One way to look at this is in terms of the dichotomy between illness and disease. So a lot of people, Arthur Kleinman is probably the most famous, described years ago this dual concept of illness and disease. And he said that, for instance, if you have somebody coming in to your clinic, that person has something that's afflicting them or it's affecting them, right? Well, doctors tend to see this as a disease. And the disease can be defined as the medical explanation of processes based on theories of biomedical science. Diabetes is an abnormality of glucose metabolism, to give you an example, okay? But on the other hand, people with that particular condition don't necessarily see it as a disease. They don't see it in those terms. They see it as an illness, and an illness is the subjective experience felt by the patient. The two are very different things, but they describe exactly the same entity, right? They're two very different things from very different perspectives with very different values, even using different vocabulary. The vocabulary of disease is one of statistics, it's one of numbers, it's one that uses a lot of words in Latin and Greek, right? The language of illness is a language that's deeply human. It's discomfort, it's anxiety, it's fear, it's pain, it's loss. So what I was very interested in doing is helping medical students, I was working in medical school in Michigan, understand that illness side so they could fully appreciate the context of the people that they were working with. So in 2003, I had the chance, so I was working actually in a basic science lab. I'd been running a lab for a number of years and got, frankly, I was successful, but got bored and tired, and I decided to do something else. So I shifted gears and went into education. And the dean at the time, or the dean of education at the time, called me in his office and said, look, we have this new project we want you to work on. We only have an outline, and it's called the Family-Centered Experience. And this started actually this adventure that went 13 years of a really great educational experiment. And what we did was we took medical students during their very first month of medical school, we paired them up with families in the community who had serious or chronic illness. And the students, these pairs of students would then go to the families' homes for a series of conversations over 2 years about the family's experiences. So the whole thing was driven by the stories that people would tell of illness and its care, okay? And the students would come back to the medical school, they would talk in small groups, and the small groups would stay the same for 3 or 4 years of medical school. So the whole idea of this family-centered experience was driven by the power of stories, right? So if we think about it, I mean, if you think as a person, if you think about what is your favorite novel, what's your favorite poem, what's your favorite song, your favorite movie, your favorite passage from one of the holy books. These are stories, and the reason why they mean so much to us is because stories are the way that human beings have, it's the most powerful way that we have of communicating meaning from one person to another. The stories we tell ourselves help us understand ourselves and each other and the world better. Think about the stories that you heard sitting on the knee of your parents when you were little. It goes that deep. So after we had designed this program and launched it and started thinking about it from more of a scholarship point of view, I asked myself the question, well, what exactly are they learning from all of this? I mean, it's great, people really like it, but what does this mean educationally? So we actually did a series of studies, and this is one of them, called Diabetes Stories. And some colleagues and I took the students who had been matched up with families in the community with people with diabetes, okay? But these families came from all over. I mean, the youngest person in the program, the youngest volunteer was 6 months old. The oldest was 95. They had kids with autism, kids with cystic fibrosis, cerebral palsy, women who had breast cancer, colon cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, all these, right? and they're telling all these stories. So we took just the folks who were working with people with diabetes, and we said, what is it that you were learning, and how is that different than what you would learn from a lecture or a book? We found that these stories had tremendous power. One of the students said, I think in this talking about his experience with listening to somebody who had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, I think you could read about the disease and understand the cause of the disease, but you don't really get the full effect about finding out about it from the beginning. When you go to the hospital and figure out why you're feeling the way you are and the shock of what to expect. At home, when they talked about when she first found out she had diabetes and how she sat in bed and cried, you don't get that from a book. You don't get the full effect of what that's like. So these stories actually had a different way of knowing things than were taught in lectures and read in books. Ironically, I also gave the diabetes lectures for medical school, so for me this was truly a schizophrenic experience. But they fostered a different way of knowing about illness and its care that was very personal. It was deeply personal, it was unique, it was human, and it was rooted in very, very specific social context. This is what happened to me, in my life, in my family. It impacted students in a variety of different levels, not just with the head. It wasn't just intellectual or cognitive, but it was with the heart. And it was also experiential. Imagine they're sitting with quiet, respectful attention, listening to somebody tell what it was like working with a child with severe developmental delay. This fostered self-reflection, perspective-taking, empathy, and personal growth. These stories had this ability to generate this type of growth. And interestingly, it wasn't just in the students, it was also in their instructors. We published a paper on this showing what deep impact this had on instructors as well. And finally, it created a lasting image of patients and families as partners in care. What is it that you want from your visits, right? What is it that you would like your doctors to say to you, or your healthcare professionals to say to you or to do to you? So what we learned was that lessons from these stories enter ourselves and come to dwell deep within us, and they enter the tacit knowledge we have of ourselves and the world. So these stories are powerful. The stories that we tell, the Reader's Theater that you had this morning, that was so wonderful. And by the way, I also meant to apologize. I saw the list of workshops and I thought, this is really cool. And I really wanted to come, but my schedule, we're actually leaving town and my schedule just wouldn't allow it. So I was kind of doing this vicariously by hearing all of these great reports coming through from the small groups. But anyway, the power of these stories are part and the core of patient-centered care, person-centered care, but what drives them is this idea of dialogue. And this has become the other aspect of my educational work that has achieved near obsession status. So enhancing education through dialogue is a very different prospect. It's not just my giving a lecture. That's why it's so ironic I'm sitting here giving you a lecture on dialogue. But it's where everybody comes in and they bring their entire selves into engaged exchanges. Okay? So there are differences, right? In communication in healthcare, we communicate different ways. Sometimes it's a discussion, sometimes it's a dialogue, sometimes it's a lecture or a lesson. So we do things differently, but for me, I began to ask myself, well, what is the difference between a discussion and a dialogue? Because those are different, the way we do them is different, the goals are different, and the educational importance of those are different as well. So, to give you an example, a healthcare provider talks with a family about possible causes and treatment plan for their child's pneumonia. Okay, so the same family, the same provider, goes on to share with the provider how their lives have been like with a 7-year-old with severe cerebral palsy. They tell a story to the healthcare provider. On the one hand, you have, this is the way we're going to treat your pneumonia. Here's why we think it's a pneumonia. Here are the antibiotics we're going to use. Here's the respiratory therapy you need, right? But what if then the provider and the family start talking about their experiences and what this means? It's a very, very different level of exchange. So in thinking about this, discussion versus dialogue, so the approach in a discussion is really with the head, right? It's very cerebral, it's very cognitive. The emphasis is on evidence. What is the evidence behind our thinking that the person has pneumonia, that the kid has pneumonia? What is the evidence that this particular medication is going to be effective, et cetera, right? The authority is preserved, right? It's usually the person with the most gray hair and the long white coat wins the argument if there's a discussion, right? And the goal is actually an answer. It's a solution. This is the antibiotic we're going to use. This is how long we're going to do it, period, right? Think about a dialogue about this family talking about their experiences with the provider. It's with the head, but it's also with the heart, and it's with presence. Again, if you have a third-year medical student who's in the room listening to this conversation, she may be thinking not only about what's going on, but she's also feeling something, and she's witnessing things, right? She's witnessing how these teams interact. The emphasis isn't just on evidence, but it's also on feelings and relationships. What kind of relationships are going on in the family? What kind of relationships do they have with the healthcare provider? And the authority is very interesting because it's actually shifted. So the family, in talking about their experiences, become more authoritative than the care provider. And the care provider listens with humility and openness to what the families live through, right? And this third-year clerk may actually have a younger brother with autism. So if she speaks when talking with the team, she may be speaking with authority that nobody, including the most senior doc on the team, has. Authority is different. It shifts. And interestingly, the goal isn't just a solution, but it's actually an enhanced understanding through opening new questions and possibilities. Well, what does this mean? What do these changes mean for all of us, right? I often like to say that a discussion ends with a period, but a dialogue often ends with a question mark. So dialogues are ways of opening up new possibilities of seeing and knowing things. And I think if we can be authentic and open and engage each other as healthcare professionals, but also engage our patients and their families in these kind of dialogues, we begin to understand things better, and we begin to focus in different ways. So there are differences, though, right? We all bring in different things into these dialogues if we're asking our whole selves to be brought in. So what do different participants bring into the dialogues? And one could say that, both patients and providers bring in their own baggage into these interactions. And I don't mean baggage in a negative sense, okay? But think about it. We bring in our own backgrounds, our values, our experiences. We bring in our own worries and our hopes. But we also bring in assumptions and biases, issues of privilege and power, and notions of stigma that may be inherited unconsciously from society, right? We live in a society that has deep, deep prejudices, and we absorb this culturally very much like we absorb the air around us. So we have to be aware of these different things when we're interacting with people, and when we interact not only with our patients, but each other. See, the thing about, so I'm a huge proponent of interprofessional education. I think there are models of doing this. I think, for instance, here, you folks really have it down to an art. I think oftentimes in medical school, we get a bunch of nursing students, medical students together, and they were supposed to play doctor. And if you don't look at the power hierarchies between these different groups, then all you do is reproduce it and make it worse. So we need to think about how we do this. We need to think about the power that healthcare professionals have when they come into a room and are dealing with patients, particularly those who have no voice or have no power themselves. So the other thing that really is something that we've used a lot in education is this idea of surprise, right? Or discomfort. So Piaget has this notion of cognitive disequilibrium, where a young child encounters something very unfamiliar, and by doing so, forces him or herself to think about things in new ways, and therefore opens their perspective up to new things. And this is something that happens in adults. We go outside of our comfort zone. We think outside of the box. So that's actually an educational technique that we can use effectively, okay? But education in some ways in healthcare become a dialogue over time in which change occurs between doctors and patients, teachers and students. So this is actually very interesting because in some ways, for instance, the dialogues, I think Darlene was saying this, the dialogues that were happening this morning in your groups, people were thinking of this beyond education. They were thinking, how do I apply this clinically? How do I think about it when I work with families and patients? Right? Education is meant to go beyond education itself. I like to use this term dialogues on the threshold. We actually have a paper that hopefully is going to get published in a few months on this. It's this idea that you have a dialogue with somebody really, really important at a moment of change, at a moment of transformation. Okay? And education, in its very sense, is a transformation, is a transformative process. We come in and end up being very different than who we were. To finish off, the title of my talk, We Make the Road While Walking, is actually, I shamelessly stole it from this one book. It's one of my favorite books by Paulo Freire and Miles Horton. Miles Horton was the head of the Highlander Institute, which was this institute of community education in Tennessee. And they ended up training a lot of the civil rights leaders in community education and activism. This is back in the 50s and the 60s. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator who worked in Brazil, in the rural areas of Brazil, teaching reading and writing. And the two of them had been working separately, right? How to give voice to those who have no voice, and how to educate for the community. And they happened, after living all their lives doing what they did, they got together for 5 days worth of conversations. And that was so somebody ran around with a microphone after them and they recorded this. But it's a wonderful piece. But the reason I bring this up is that as care providers, okay, as physicians, as social workers, as OT, PT, speech pathologists, right, we have these conversations and we make these roads forward, we make the paths while we talk in dialogue about new possibilities for our patients and their families. And that gives us strength, it gives us independence, and it gives us humanity. I'd like to close by briefly considering this concept by Martin Heidegger called the clearing of the mystery in some of his early work, and later on he really elaborated on this. So Heidegger says that there's this opening or clearing, like a clearing of a forest, in which being becomes fully realized in all of its mystery and possibilities of becoming. So I would like to pose that in some ways the clinical environment and the educational environment are open spaces, in some ways sacred spaces in which we enter and interact with each other, and in doing so we leave different. Our patients leave changed, but so do we. And we need to understand this and reflect on it in order to harness the power of that transformation to do good and to heal and to serve justice. Paulo Freire says that teaching is the practice of freedom. And that's something I absolutely believe. We are doing all of this to rehumanize relationships and to free ourselves from suffering and oppression. I'd like to acknowledge Holland Bloor Review. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here today. My chair, Jillian Harker, who is the one who convinced me to cross the border. Some colleagues, but also Ayelet Cooper, Lisa Richardson, are actually, we have a person-centered care initiative in the Department of Medicine that is heading up this on a department-wide scale. We already have people in pediatrics and psychiatry and OBGYN who are wanting to replicate the model. So hopefully this is spreading. And this is the subject of conversation internationally as well. I'd also need to acknowledge the FM Hill Foundation for support of my work. And above all of you for your kind attention and support. Thank you very much.
I would just like to start before we're opening up for questions, just to thank Arno. That was an amazing talk. I was trying to take pictures of all these quotes that were going up there and books to read, and I've got like a whole list. Wow, truly inspiring and allowed us to think, I think, in a very different way. I'd like to open it up for some questions. We do have a few minutes. So maybe oh, good, Anne, thank you.
Thank you so much for an amazing talk. I'm thinking a little bit about what you brought forward around discussion versus dialogue. And it would seem to me that in trying to think about the concept of dialogue and teach that to our students, that there also needs to be an openness that's there on the part of the teacher and on the part of the student. I'd love to hear your reflections on how we might foster that openness with our students.
That's a great question. Thank you, and I think that actually goes to the heart of the dialogical teaching. How do you foster? Yes. How do you foster essentially the sense of openness for both teachers and students? That's at the heart of the question, right? And see, dialogue isn't just communication. Dialogue's relationship. So the big question becomes, how do you foster a sense of openness and safety for the people who engage in these kind of conversations? And part of this is that we need, I think, and especially in medicine. I mean, in medicine, we're just, we are so high up on the pedestal that we knock our heads against the ceiling every time we stand up, and it drives me crazy. And we need to really think about the idea of risk. If we're asking our students, when exposed to really difficult situations and suffering, to risk emotionally and even psychologically, we ourselves have to take a risk. We ourselves have to say, look, I am in a vulnerable space here. There's disclosure, and there's disclosure, of course, but at the same time, the faculty, see, the difference between a dialogue and a lecture is I can stand up here and I have exactly what I'm going to tell you, and I can tell it to you. A dialogue, I open it up and I have no idea what you're going to say, right? I mean, somebody could start hooting like a monkey. And that's a risk. Dialogue involves risk. And if the one thing is that the teacher has to be willing to take that risk along with the student, otherwise it doesn't work, right? There's also this idea of power. Power infuses all of the communications we have, and how do we try to flatten that out a bit? How do we try to withdraw the sense of privilege I have and to ask myself, well, what is it that I do that I'm assuming is the right way to do things? And how does that silence the other person, right? I mean, the term mansplaining and all this, right? And the guys who say something and somebody, some woman has said it 10 minutes before, but yet it's that guy's idea and that's a really good idea. I mean, this kind of, this is silly, but we have to think about these kind of things in order to open it up, because otherwise we end up silencing. So does that make sense? But interestingly, we have to be careful because, yes, we need to protect ourselves and our students from trauma, but at the same time, discomfort isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? We sometimes need discomfort to kind of shake people up. I call it making strange. We twist things a little bit so it makes people look at things in a new way.
Any other questions? Maybe I can just,
Sure.
I was intrigued also around the dialogue. And you talked about doctor-patient, you talked about teacher-student, but one of the things I think we've been seeing more and more of here at Holland Bloorview, and I think it's thanks to our amazing family leadership program, is we see family leader, educator, or as the teacher, and then the student. And I think that provides almost a third journey, if you can, in terms of educating our students along, I think what you were trying to do by your study that you first started in Michigan. And I don't know if it's because we're so lucky to have amazing family leaders here at Holland Bloorview, or is it that this is the new wave and a new way of educating our health professions going forward?
So, Golda, I think that's also incredibly important. The role, the partnerships between families and educators, or families and researchers, have is increasingly important. I mean, just last week I actually flew to Montreal with one of my colleagues to spend time at the University of Montreal because they have a patient-family partnership. It's a patient-family partnership with academics. So it's not only in education, it's in healthcare, and it's research. And they have this incredibly robust program of patient partnerships. So they actually talked about discomfort, because I've been working on this idea of person-centered care for such a long time, and they said, that's so 1980s. And they said, we're not working on patient-centered care because the patient shouldn't be in the middle, but the patient should be a partner. So if you think about a patient in the middle, that's like sitting in the middle of the table. How can they have a discussion if they're in the middle, right? So, but anyway, there are ways of doing this and doing it really creatively, and I think that's where we follow your lead in how this can be done really creatively, innovatively, and effectively.
Yeah. Thank you. Last question? Then we'll just thank you again for truly an inspiring talk and for coming to share your expertise.